The late spring sun cast a golden glow over the serene farmlands of southern Kentucky, where rolling fields stretched endlessly beneath a sky of soft watercolor hues. The land, dotted with weathered barns and grazing livestock, hummed with life as it always had. Yet, for one tiny family, tragedy had just struck in the most unexpected and heartbreaking of ways. Beside a still pond, surrounded by cattails and reeds, nestled beneath the shade of a willow tree, a duck named Daisy had made her nest. For weeks, she had carefully tended to her eggs, patiently awaiting the day her ducklings would hatch. She was a devoted mother, her soft quacks lulling the little ones inside their shells as she sat protectively over them, shielding them from harm. Life here, on the farm owned by the gentle-hearted Bennett family, was peaceful. That is, until the quiet morning when the unthinkable happened. The pond was still, the air warm with the promise of a beautiful day, when a sudden rustle in the underbrush shattered the calm. A fox, thin and desperate, lunged from the shadows. Daisy barely had time to react. The farmer's dog, Rusty, barked from the nearby barn, but he was too far away. Daisy quacked frantically, leading the predator away from her nest with a bravery only a mother could muster. She flapped her wings, drawing the fox deeper into the woods and away from her babies. The farm fell silent once more. Hours passed, but Daisy did not return. Under the shade of the willow, her eggs began to wobble, tiny cracks forming on their delicate shells. One by one, 5 fuzzy ducklings emerged into a world where their mother's love had already made the ultimate sacrifice. They chirped, fragile and confused, their tiny bodies huddling together for warmth and security. They didn't know it yet, but they were alone. Life on the Bennett farm carried on, though a sense of loss hung in the air. Emily Bennett, the farmer's teenage daughter, had grown up on this land and knew its rhythms as intimately as her own heartbeat. She had spent countless hours by the pond, sketching animals in her worn leather journal, dreaming of one day becoming a wildlife artist. It was Emily who found the ducklings the next morning. She crouched by the nest, her chest tightening at the sight. The 5 ducklings chirped in a soft, plaintive chorus, their tiny bodies trembling. They were heartbreakingly small, their downy feathers still wet from hatching. Emily looked around, calling softly for Daisy, but deep down she already knew. Her hand moved instinctively to her chest, clutching the silver locket her late mother had given her, a reminder of loss and love intertwined. "What am I going to do with you?" she whispered, her voice cracking as she reached down to gently scoop up the tiny ducklings. Emily carried them back to the farmhouse, placing them in a cardboard box lined with a soft towel. She made them a warm mash of oatmeal and water, using a dropper to feed them. But the ducklings chirped incessantly, their cries cutting through the air like tiny needles. They weren't just hungry, they were grieving. In the barn, another pair of ears perked up at the sound of the ducklings' cries. Whiskers, a large orange tabby with a white chest and piercing green eyes, lifted his head from his perch on a hay bale. Whiskers was known around the farm as a loner. Rescued as a stray years ago, he was fiercely independent and rarely sought out human or animal companionship. He preferred the quiet corners of the barn, where he could nap undisturbed or watch the world with a detached curiosity. But something about those cries stirred something deep within the old cat. Whiskers stretched lazily and leapt down from the hay bale. He padded out of the barn and toward the farmhouse, his tail swishing purposefully. Emily barely noticed as he entered through the open back door. The ducklings' cries had consumed her attention, and she was on the verge of tears herself, overwhelmed by the enormity of the task ahead. Then, without warning, Whiskers leapt onto the kitchen table where the box of ducklings sat. Emily gasped, startled by the intrusion. "Whiskers, no!" she cried, reaching out to shoo him away. But the cat ignored her. To her astonishment, Whiskers didn't lash out at the ducklings or attempt to harm them. Instead, he carefully lowered his large, warm body into the box, curling around the tiny birds. The ducklings hesitated for only a moment before instinctively burrowing into his fur, their cries softening as they found the warmth and security they had been searching for. Emily stared, slack-jawed, as the cat began to purr, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the room. The ducklings chirped contentedly, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, She had never seen Whiskers behave like this. The aloof, solitary cat had become a surrogate parent in the blink of an eye. "Looks like you've got some new responsibilities, buddy," she said softly, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and amazement. The days that followed were unlike anything Emily, or anyone else on the farm, had ever seen. Whiskers took his new role as caretaker seriously. Wherever the ducklings went, he followed, his green eyes watchful and alert. At night, they nestled against his fur, their tiny bodies warm and safe. During the day, he herded them gently with his paw when they wandered too far, his patience seemingly endless. Whiskers' transformation from a solitary observer to a devoted guardian didn't go unnoticed. Word spread quickly among the Bennetts' neighbors, who came to see the mother cat and her unlikely brood. Emily captured every moment in her journal, her sketches coming to life with a newfound tenderness she hadn't known she possessed. But beneath the surface of this heartwarming tale, questions lingered. Could a cat truly raise ducklings? What would happen as the ducklings grew? And, most importantly, would this fragile, makeshift family endure the tests of time? As the sun set over the Kentucky hills, casting long shadows across the farm, Whiskers lay in the grass near the pond, the ducklings cuddled up against him. Emily watched from a distance, her heart full and heavy all at once. She didn't have all the answers, but for now, this moment was enough. Little did she know, the challenges that lay ahead would test the strength of this extraordinary bond and change all of their lives forever. The days turned into weeks, and Whiskers' bond with the ducklings deepened. Emily named the 5 ducklings based on their tiny, unique quirks. Pip, the smallest and the boldest, with a chirp that was almost as loud as a squeak. Clover, whose waddling always led her in circles. Dipper, who seemed obsessed with sticking his beak in every puddle. Sunny, who had the brightest yellow feathers. And Midge, the shy one, always trailing behind. Whiskers took his role as their protector with an uncharacteristic seriousness. His usually aloof demeanor was gone, replaced with an almost parental vigilance. Despite the heartwarming connection that formed between them, Emily couldn't ignore her growing worry. Ducklings weren't meant to stay small forever. In a matter of weeks, they would begin to outgrow their dependence, their natural instincts urging them to explore the pond and beyond. They were wild animals after all, and Emily wondered what would happen to their fragile family when that time came. Would Whiskers let them go? Could they even survive without him? But the first challenge wasn't nature. It was a storm. One sweltering summer evening, the air turned thick and oppressive, and Emily felt the change before the first rumble of thunder rolled across the hills. A storm was coming. The skies darkened quickly, the golden fields taking on an eerie, greenish tint. In the barn, Whiskers had herded the ducklings into a corner, curling protectively around them as the wind howled outside. Emily rushed in just as the first flash of lightning lit up the sky. "Whiskers, you've got to stay here with them," she said, her voice trembling as she bent to stroke his head. "It's going to get bad." As if understanding her, the cat purred softly and tightened his hold on the ducklings. Pip chirped loudly in response, as though reassuring her that they'd be fine. But as the storm raged on, the old barn creaked and groaned under the force of the wind. Emily stayed with them for hours, singing softly to calm the ducklings, her heart racing with every crack of thunder. It was around midnight when disaster struck. A deafening snap echoed through the barn as one of the old wooden beams gave way. Emily screamed as debris came crashing down, sending up a cloud of dust and straw. When the air cleared, she saw it. The section of the barn where Whiskers and the ducklings had been was buried beneath splintered wood. "No!" Emily cried, scrambling to the pile of debris, her hands trembling as she clawed at the wreckage. Tears blurred her vision as her mind raced with dread. Whiskers had become more than just a cat. He was family, as much as the ducklings were. To her astonishment, a muffled chirp rose from beneath the rubble. Then another, and another. "Hold on," she sobbed, her voice hoarse as she worked frantically. Finally, she uncovered a small pocket of space where Whiskers had somehow shielded all 5 ducklings with his body. His fur was matted with dust, and his eyes blinked slowly, as if to say, "We're okay," but that was close. Emily let out a shaky laugh of relief, tears streaming down her face as she gently scooped the ducklings into her arms. Whiskers staggered to his feet, shaking himself off and letting out a quiet, gravelly meow as if to reassure her. "You're a miracle worker, Whiskers," she whispered, hugging the cat gently. The storm passed by morning, leaving the barn damaged but standing. Emily carried Whiskers and the ducklings back to the house, where they spent the day recovering from their terrifying ordeal. Whiskers barely left their side, even when Emily tried to coax him with his favorite treat, a saucer of warm milk. It was as if he knew that, as fragile as the ducklings were, their little family was still teetering on the edge of survival. But it wasn't just nature testing their bond. As the ducklings grew stronger and more curious, they began to explore the farm with an enthusiasm that kept Whiskers constantly on edge. One particularly nerve-wracking day, Pip managed to waddle off toward the pond, while Whiskers was distracted by Clover, who had somehow gotten herself stuck in a feeding trough. By the time Whiskers found Pip, the tiny duckling had stumbled dangerously close to the water, where a snapping turtle lurked just beneath the surface. Emily, watching from the porch, gasped as Whiskers bolted toward the pond in a blur of orange and white fur. He reached Pip just in time, swatting the duckling back with his paw and hissing furiously at the turtle, who retreated into the murky depths. "Pip, you're going to give him a heart attack?" Emily called out, half laughing, half crying in relief. These moments became more frequent as the ducklings grew. Emily could see that Whiskers was struggling to balance his protective instincts with their natural desire for independence. At times, the cat seemed almost frustrated, his tail flicking anxiously as the ducklings waddled farther and farther from his side. But no matter how much they tested his patience, Whiskers always kept them safe. One evening, as Emily sat by the pond sketching the unlikely family, her father joined her, a quiet, thoughtful man. Mr. Work. Bennett had always marveled at the resilience of life on the farm, but even he was moved by what he saw in Whiskers and the ducklings. "There's something, aren't they?" he said, sitting down beside her. Emily nodded, her pencil pausing on the page. I don't know what's going to happen when they're old enough to leave." Her father was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the water. "You can't keep them here forever, Em. They're wild at heart, and that's where they'll go when the time's right." "But don't you think Whiskers already knows that?" Emily's chest tightened. She had tried not to think about it, but she knew her father was right. As much as Whiskers loved the ducklings, and as much as they seemed to love him, there would come a day when their bond would be tested in the hardest way imaginable. "Do you think he'll let them go?" she asked softly. Her father smiled faintly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I think when the time comes, he'll do what's best for them. That's what love does." The words lingered in Emily's mind long after the sun had set, casting the pond in hues of deep purple and orange. She looked over at Whiskers, who had settled into his usual spot in the grass with the ducklings nestled against him. The sight filled her with both warmth and an ache she couldn't quite describe. Little did Emily know, the moment of truth was approaching faster than any of them were prepared for. The morning was quiet, too quiet. Emily awoke to the first rays of sunlight streaming through her window and immediately felt a strange sense of unease. Usually the chirps of Pip, Clover, Dipper, Sunny, and Midge were the soundtrack to the dawn, but today the farmhouse was eerily still. Throwing on a jacket, Emily rushed downstairs and found Whiskers pacing nervously by the door, his tail flicking with agitation. He let out a low, mournful meow as she opened the door, and then bolted outside without hesitation. "Whiskers, what is it?" Emily called, her heart pounding as she followed him across the dew-soaked grass. When she reached the pond, her stomach dropped. The ducklings were gone. Emily's mind raced. They weren't old enough to fend for themselves yet. They still relied on Whiskers' protection and her care. A dozen fears clawed at her thoughts. Had a predator gotten to them? Had they wandered too far and gotten lost? She dropped to her knees by the water's edge, scanning the shoreline for any sign of them. Whiskers, however, didn't panic. He sniffed the ground with precision, his green eyes narrowing as he caught a scent. With a flick of his tail, he darted off toward the tall grass on the far side of the pond. Emily scrambled to her feet and followed, her boots sinking into the damp earth. She pushed through the reeds, her breath coming in short gasps, and then she saw them. The ducklings were huddled together at the edge of a narrow creek that fed into the pond. They chirped frantically, their tiny bodies trembling as they stared at the rushing water before them. On the other side of the creek, a family of wild ducks had gathered, quacking and preening in the early morning sun. Emily realized what had happened. The ducklings had heard the calls of their own kind and had followed the sound, instinct driving them toward the wild ducks. But now, faced with the swift-moving creek, they were stuck, too small and too scared to cross. Whiskers emerged from the grass just as Emily did, his body tensing as he took in the scene. The sight of his ducklings so close to danger and so close to leaving seemed to strike something deep within him. He let out a sharp, commanding meow and stepped forward, placing himself between the ducklings and the creek. "Whiskers, wait," Emily whispered, crouching low. She didn't want to interfere just yet. This felt like a pivotal moment, one that Whiskers needed to handle on his own. The cat turned to the ducklings, nudging them gently with his nose. Pip chirped in protest, but Whiskers stood firm, his green eyes full of a quiet intensity. It was as if he was trying to communicate something Emily could only guess at. Then, with a deep breath, Whiskers stepped into the creek. Emily gasped as the water swirled around his legs, but Whiskers didn't falter. He moved slowly but deliberately, his fur plastered to his body as the current pushed against him. The ducklings watched, their tiny heads tilting as they chirped anxiously. When Whiskers reached the other side, he turned back to face them, his soaked tail flicking. He let out another low, encouraging meow, and then something incredible happened. Pip, the boldest of the ducklings, took a tentative step forward. His little webbed feet slipped on the muddy bank, but he didn't stop. With a determined chirp, he waddled into the water, paddling furiously as the current pulled at him. "Come on, Pip," Emily whispered, her hands clenching into fists as she watched. Whiskers stretched out a paw, guiding Pip toward the shore. When the duckling finally reached him, Whiskers gently nudged him onto solid ground. One by one, the other ducklings followed. Clover was next, her clumsy movements almost sending her downstream, but Whiskers was ready, his sharp reflexes saving her just in time. Dipper, Sunny, and finally Midge crossed the creek, each of them relying on Whiskers' steady presence to guide them. By the time all 5 ducklings were safely on the other side, Emily's cheeks were wet with tears. She stayed hidden in the reeds, her heart aching as she watched the scene unfold. The family of wild ducks began to quack louder, calling to the newcomers. The ducklings hesitated, looking back at Whiskers with a mix of uncertainty and longing. For a moment, Whiskers seemed torn. He looked at the ducklings, then at the wild ducks, his green eyes flickering with an emotion Emily couldn't quite place. Finally, he stepped forward and gave each duckling a gentle nudge, encouraging them to move toward the others. Pip was the first to join the wild ducks, chirping excitedly as he was welcomed into the group. The others followed, their movements hesitant at first but growing more confident with each step. When the last duckling, Midge, reached the wild ducks, she paused and looked back at Whiskers. The old cat stood at the edge of the creek, his wet fur glistening in the sunlight. For a moment, the two simply stared at each other. Then, Midge let out a soft chirp, as if to say goodbye, before waddling off to join her siblings. Whiskers sat down, his tail wrapping around his paws as he watched the wild ducks lead his ducklings toward the pond. His posture was calm, but Emily could see the faint rise and fall of his chest, the subtle twitch of his ears. He had done what he needed to do. Emily finally stepped out from her hiding spot, her heart heavy yet full. She crouched down beside Whiskers, stroking his damp fur as tears streamed down her face. "You let them go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You knew it was time, didn't you?" Whiskers let out a low purr, leaning into her touch. For a long time, the two of them sat together by the creek, watching as the ducklings disappeared into the reeds with their new family. Emily's chest ached with pride and sadness all at once. She had worried about this moment for so long, but now that it had come, she realized just how much Whiskers had taught her. Letting go wasn't a loss, it was an act of love. But the story wasn't over yet. Though the ducklings had crossed into the wild, their bond with Whiskers wasn't so easily severed. And in the weeks that followed, Whiskers would prove once again that family isn't defined by blood, but by the love and care we give to one another. Life on the farm settled into a quieter rhythm after the ducklings joined their new family. Emily found herself lingering by the pond each morning, hoping for a glimpse of them. Sometimes she caught sight of Pip splashing in the water, or Sunny darting after insects, their bright yellow feathers blending into the reeds. Other times, they didn't appear at all, lost in the embrace of the wild that now claimed them. Whiskers, however, remained a constant presence by the pond. Every day he would saunter down to the water's edge, his sharp green eyes scanning the horizon. Emily didn't know what he was looking for. Perhaps he hoped to see the ducklings again. Or maybe he was simply guarding the place where he had said goodbye. But weeks turned into months, and the ducklings grew into sleek, strong ducks. Their feathers darkened, their bodies grew larger, and their once timid chirps became confident quacks. They had become part of the wild flock, free and thriving in a way Emily knew they couldn't have if they had stayed with her and Whiskers. It should have been a relief, but Emily couldn't shake the pang of loss that lingered in her heart. She had sketched countless images of Whiskers and the ducklings in her journal, capturing every moment of their improbable bond. But now the pages felt like memories of a time that had slipped away too quickly. Whiskers, too, seemed restless. Though he spent most of his time around the farmhouse, napping in sunny patches or keeping the mice at bay, Emily noticed that he often disappeared in the evenings, only to return hours later, his fur smelling faintly of grass and water. She wondered if he was searching for the ducklings, but she didn't have the heart to follow him. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves turned fiery shades of red and orange, Emily decided to take a walk to clear her mind. She hadn't visited the far side of the pond since the day the ducklings crossed the creek, and something in her heart told her it was time. She strolled through the fields, the cool breeze tugging at her hair, until she reached the familiar cluster of reeds by the water. The pond was quiet, its surface like glass, reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. For a moment, Emily simply stood there, breathing in the stillness. Then she heard it, a soft quack, followed by another and another. Her heart leapt as she turned toward the sound. Emerging from the reeds were 5 ducks, their sleek feathers glistening in the light. She recognized them instantly: Pip, Clover, Dipper, Sunny, and Midge. They were grown now, their bodies strong and graceful, but there was no mistaking the little quirks that had endeared them to her. Pip, as always, was in the lead, his boldness evident in the way he swam ahead of the others. "Guys?" Emily whispered, her voice catching in her throat. As if they understood, the ducks swam closer, their quacks growing louder. Emily knelt by the water's edge, tears streaming down her face as she watched them. They didn't come too close, keeping a respectful distance, but their presence was enough. And then, as if on cue, Whiskers appeared. The old tabby emerged from the tall grass, his steps measured and purposeful. When he saw the ducks, his ears perked and his tail twitched. For a moment, he simply stood there watching them. Then, without hesitation, he walked to the water's edge and sat down, his green eyes fixed on his former brood. The ducks quacked softly, a sound that Emily swore carried a sense of recognition. Pip swam a little closer, his head tilting in that curious way Emily remembered so well. Whiskers didn't move, but his purring was audible even from where Emily knelt. The reunion wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was perfect in its simplicity. The ducks stayed for a while, swimming lazily near the shore as Whiskers kept watch. Emily sat quietly, sketching the scene in her journal, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in months. Eventually, the ducks began to drift away, their movements slow and reluctant. Pip was the last to leave, his gaze lingering on Whiskers before he turned to follow his siblings. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Emily reached out to stroke Whiskers' fur. He leaned into her touch, his purring steady and calm. "They remember you," she whispered, "and they're okay. You did it, Whiskers. You gave them a chance to live." The cat blinked slowly, his green eyes soft with what Emily could only describe as contentment. Over the next few weeks, the ducks returned often, their visits becoming a quiet ritual that Emily and Whiskers both cherished. Each time they stayed a little longer, as if they, too, missed the family they had once been. Emily began to sketch them together again, her drawings capturing the beauty of a bond that had transcended nature itself. As the first snow of winter dusted the farm, Emily sat by the fire one evening, flipping through her journal. Page after page was filled with images of Whiskers and the Ducklings. Their first days together, the storm that nearly tore them apart, the creek they had crossed, and now their bittersweet reunions. She paused on a page where she had written a single line beneath a sketch of Whiskers curled around the Ducklings. Family is love, and love is letting go. It was a lesson she had learned not just from Whiskers, but from the Ducklings as well. They had shown her that love wasn't about holding on, it was about giving, protecting, and trusting that the bond would remain, no matter the distance. Looking down at Whiskers, who was curled up on the rug by the fire, Emily smiled. The old cat had taught her more than she could have ever imagined. And as the snow fell softly outside, she knew one thing for certain. The family they had built, however unusual, would always be a part of her heart. Whiskers stretched lazily, his purring filling the quiet room. Outside, the faint sound of ducks quacking echoed through the night, a reminder that love endures in the most unexpected ways. Winter settled over the Bennett farm like a soft, quiet blanket. The pond froze over, its surface shimmering like glass in the pale morning light. The wild ducks had migrated south, their cheerful quacks no longer echoing through the reeds. Emily missed them, especially Pip, Clover, Dipper, Sunny, and Midge, but their absence didn't sting as much as she had feared. She knew they were where they were meant to be, free, strong, and thriving. Whiskers, as always, was her steadfast companion. The old tabby had returned to his quiet routines, but Emily knew he wasn't the same cat he had been before. He had changed. He was no longer just a solitary observer of the farm. He was a protector, a teacher, a nurturer. In a way, he had become the heart of the farm, and Emily loved him all the more for it. One crisp morning, Emily bundled up in her thickest coat and ventured out to the pond. She carried her journal with her, its pages now filled with the story of Whiskers and the Ducklings. Every sketch and note a testament to the unlikely family they had become. She reached the water's edge and stood there for a moment, her breath clouding in the cold air. Opening her journal, she flipped to the final page and began to sketch. Her pencil moved carefully, deliberately, capturing the memory of Whiskers curled around the Ducklings, their tiny bodies nestled against his warm fur. When she was finished, she wrote one final note beneath the image. Family isn't defined by who you're born to, but by who loves and protects you. And sometimes the most unlikely bonds can become the most unbreakable. As she closed the journal, Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. Whiskers padded up beside her, his fur brushing against her leg, and she knelt to scratch behind his ears. "You taught me so much," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You reminded me that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to, and that letting go isn't the end, it's just another kind of love." Whiskers let out a soft purr, leaning into her hand. That spring, when the ice melted and the farm burst back to life, Emily spotted the ducks again. Pip, Clover, Dipper, Sunny, and Midge had returned, their quacks filling the air as they circled the pond. They were no longer ducklings, but fully grown, their sleek feathers glinting in the sunlight. Whiskers was the first to notice. He trotted down to the water's edge and sat there, his tail swishing as the ducks waddled onto the shore. Emily watched from a distance, her heart swelling as the old cat and the grown ducks greeted each other in their quiet, familiar way. It wasn't a goodbye. It never had been. It was love, unspoken, enduring, and infinite.